Welcome to this Vital Health podcast. I'm Duane Schulthess, the CEO of Vital Transformation. Today I'm speaking to Tim Scott, who took the reins as the CEO of Biocom California last year. Tim has more than 20 years of experience in the biopharmaceutical sector, from spinning out firms from UC San Diego to successfully leading companies to acquisitions by BioMarin and Novartis. Tim, congratulations. It's great to see you.
Good to be with you again, Duane.
So Biocom, you folks have been here for 30 years, 1995 founded. It really follows the evolution of the biotech ecosystem. How has it developed over the last 30 years? How has it changed?
Yeah, it's a fun question to talk about because there's some amazing history there that goes all the way back to the beginnings of the biotech industry in California. Biocom came out of a group called BIC, B-I-C, Biocom Industry Council. And the first issue they ever really dealt with was a municipal policy issue, and it was over water. Mm-hmm. Back in the 80s, there was a drought, severe drought in Southern California. The San Diego City Council decided they needed to shut off the water periodically in order to deal with the drought situation. A small handful of CEOs that were running biotech companies in San Diego got together and said, we need water to operate. The problem was the City Council had no idea what biotechnology was. Mm-hmm. And the CEOs had no idea how to deal with policy issues. And they didn't even know where City Council was located to be able to go down and meet with them. So that was really the start of BIC, which became Biocom. And that was, we need to be able to get together on issues that we all care about and move those issues forward. And to this day, Biocom's the only trade organization that I know about that still has municipal policy as a core part of its policy group.
And you drive down here past Research Park Drive, you come down, you make a left, you've got Merck, you've got Lilly, you've got all of these biotech companies that are forming here. Why is this ecosystem so powerful? What makes it so different?
Each region in California has its own unique personality. Generally speaking, for California, it has a lot to do with the fact that we have a really strong intellectual network here that includes Stanford and the UC systems. It also includes the Ludwig Institute and other research institutions like Scripps and Salk and Sanford Burnham. All of that together creates this intellectual network that is just ripe for innovation.
I could walk 20 minutes and I'd be at UCSD and the biotech corridor there. You got Scripps right across the street. It just seems like this is such a major hub. Roughly 1/3 of all biotech products over the last 20 years, in one way or another, are connected to California specifically. What is it about California when you compare it to, say, Switzerland or Germany or France, or dare I say other parts of the United States, Massachusetts? What is it about California and the ecosystem here that's so unique?
It's still, to this day, about 25 to 30% of all drugs approved each year have come from California, manufacturers, research. The intellectual network is important. The VC support system that we have here is unparalleled. But we're also, if you think about it, a big geography. California is a big state. Yeah. We have 4 top 20 clusters in the state with the Bay Area, San Diego, LA, and a lot of people overlook Orange County with a strong device group there. You look at that and you think, wow, that's a lot going on. Massachusetts is about 1/20th of the size of California. And if you extended a California-sized state from Boston, it would go all the way to Research Triangle Park. And at that point, a size of a state that big would probably have a larger economic output than California would.
Yeah, because you're getting, there'll be Raleigh-Durham, going up to Washington, D.C., up through, Delaware. I mean, you capture.
They give us a run for our money.
Well, speaking of money, obviously one of the key points around California's success is the access to liquidity and capital. The VC market here has been hugely important. You've worked as a VC. What is it about venture capital in California that makes it different? What is it about the risk capital and the risk appetite within this state that has driven so much success?
It really starts at the university level. I mean, you have researchers that treat it as a badge of honor to spin out a company from their lab. A lot of that comes from the fact that we also have great NIH funding. I mean, $6 billion of NIH or NSF funding comes to California, and that kind of resource, which is critical to the creation of innovative products, starts at the university and the research level. And then what we need at that point is SBIRs, TTR, funding to be able to cross the valley of death. And at that point, you've got the VCs waiting for you. But to have a robust system, ecosystem for supporting that all the way to the VCs is what that venture capital community appreciates and supports. And it's great to have them in this state supporting everything that we're doing.
Now, we looked at the Inflation Reduction Act in the context of venture capital in a study we published last year. We saw enormous impacts from the Inflation Reduction Act on early stage VC and the choice of products they were going after. In other words, the higher the exposure to Medicare, we saw a pullback from small molecules. And we've also seen an overall decline in venture capital writ large for the entire sector. We're seeing this broadly across the United States. How is California handling that?
Yeah, there's no question that the IRA has had an impact. When you talk to a VC 5 years ago, when this was first being discussed, the VCs would say, look, if someone's going to come to us looking for money, they have to have a plan for IRA. They have to have modeled out what the revenue is going to be on that particular product, keeping in mind that there's going to be Medicare negotiations somewhere down the line. It has a real effect on those things. And that's why the pill penalty is so important to us and making sure that we address that. It's also why orphan exemption is going to be important in that IRA.
There's a lot of talk right now in DC. We're hearing that there's some pushback on that orphan exemption. Are you concerned that that actually may come to fruition and there may be a pullback, particularly, given how the midterms are looking? What you have now that's actually good could end up getting pulled back if that orphan exemption goes away. Are you concerned about that?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about that. I started a company called Tika Therapeutics that was focused on lysosomal storage disorders. About 40 different disorders, all considered rare diseases. As we modeled out our revenue for an area called MPS 3A, the revenues to start were in the $20 to $50 million range.
Yeah.
And the top line revenue was about $200 million.
That sounds like a huge amount of money, but actually that's a small indication.
It's a tiny amount of money. And it costs the same amount to develop that enzyme replacement therapy as it costs to develop an antibody for a very large market like a GLP-1, for example. The costs are the same to get there, but the revenue on the other end of it is not nearly the same.
Peter Kolchinsky and I and several people have looked at this. Amitabh Chandra, we're saying, look, you're looking at a 50% revenue hit with what's been negotiated so far out of CMS looking at these IRA negotiations. What would happen if you look at this asset, which would have been peak revenue of $200 million, suddenly you're down to $100 million? Is that investable at that point?
For most people, it's not investable. And this is why the exemption is so important, because even if a major, larger pharma company says, hey, we want to get into the business of an orphan indication, and eventually we're going to take that to a larger indication. And some people say, why would you let them do that? That's not playing fair. The fact is that if we get an orphan indication for every large indication that exists out there, that's a huge win for orphan indications and a huge win for anybody that has a child that's born with an orphan indication.
So if we take this in a historical context, California's productivity versus the rest of the world, and let's roll back the clock to 1980. I live in Belgium, and we're seeing enormous declines in biopharmaceutical productivity in Europe. In 1980, Europe produced 60% of all assets. Now, in the last study we did, we found 17% of assets came out of Europe. There's been an enormous decline. A lot of this comes down to policy decisions that have been made in the EU, specifically attacking biopharma pricing, biopharma revenue. You now have a very interesting situation here where a member of the House, Ro Khanna, represents California, is talking about a billionaire's tax that would put a 5% total global cap on unrealized capital. Now that may sound like a distinction, but that means you haven't sold it. It's potentially of value, but you may have no cash in your pocket. Just because you own something doesn't mean it's actually worth that. What would happen if we start going up to people who are forming capital and putting risk down on the barrelhead with real money? If we're saying, okay, you got to realize 5%, this has to go away, what's going to happen to the California biotech ecosystem if this occurs?
Yeah, well, potentially. I mean, it could have a devastating effect, especially if we're looking at most favored nation. And by the way, I don't know too many biotech billionaires.
Do you wish you did?
I even Googled biotech billionaires at one point, and the top two were were Bill Gates and Peter Thiel. So
Yeah.
there's certainly investors in biotech. When you look at
But Peter Thiel just left California.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. When you talk to CEOs in biotech, it's not about the money as much as it is about solving unmet needs, pushing science forward. I mean, that's really the juice for us.
So if we look at the biotech sector historically, biotech was large molecules and the pharmaceutical sector was small molecules, even to the point where both FDA and the European Medicines Agency have different regulatory pathways for small and large molecules. What's happened over the last 20 years since the biologic regulation was passed? Are we seeing convergence? Is it still a smart way to look at this where they're both different, or do you see them just basically intermingling now? Is there any distinction anymore between a biotech and a pharma firm?
Yeah, I think it's just semantics
Yeah.
at this point. I mean, it used to be the biotech firm meant that you were engineering cells with recombinant technologies to develop new drugs, whereas a small molecule was a synthetic molecule. Companies like Genentech and Amgen still maintain that biotech moniker, but for the most part, the larger companies are considered pharma companies and the smaller ones are VC-backed or considered biotech companies. But if you look at a company like Genentech, Ashley Mukherjee, she had a very interesting talk the other day where she was talking about, we go after certain unmet medical needs, and that's very important to us. They have centers of excellence in every modality. So whether it's cell therapy, gene therapy, small molecule, biologic, CRISPR, it doesn't matter. They have a center of excellence in each one of those. Whichever one works for that unmet medical need, that's the one they're going to move forward.
When we look at legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, or MFN, that put such pressures on what have historically been 70% of the asset class, the small molecules. Is there a real lack of understanding of the incentive structure here? Because we're seeing enormous pivots to biologics and not necessarily modalities where you'd want to see biologics. Do you think that the regulators just don't get the distinction anymore, that the fact is that these industries are merging based on the science, not necessarily because of the distinction between large and small molecules?
It is interesting to try to understand what the pill penalty is all about and what this distinction is between small molecule and large molecule. When I've spoken to legislators about it, they seem to understand that the IRA was not perfect as it was conceived, and there's some things that need to be sanded off to make it work better. To deal with things like the orphan exemption, and specifically the pill penalty, is very important because it's important for people to understand that every drug that's approved is eventually going to be a generic drug.
Yeah.
And it's going to drop to 10% of whatever the original price was. The beauty of small molecule drugs is that they're very inexpensive to manufacture. It's very cheap to manufacture a pill as opposed to programming a cell to produce a drug. And so the penalty doesn't make any sense from that perspective. We should want small molecule drugs, and a lot of them. And the current legislation discourages people from developing small molecule drugs. And I think the vital transformation data has shown that.
It's really disconcerting that there's been this capricious approach to regulation just for political expedience, and it has nothing really to do with science or innovation. It's really concerning to us. There's a broad agreement that something needs to be done, but yet I don't see anybody actually trying to propose anything that's tangible. I mean, we had the EPIC Act, that didn't go through. Are you concerned that the politicians are going to come back and say, okay, well then we're just going to make everything 9 years?
That's problematic as well, as
Sure.
you know. And I think the part of the issue is that things have become far too politicized.
Yeah.
We represent the party of life sciences and moving that forward. And we think that there is a lot of legislators that do listen to industry and listen to the scientists and say, what is it that will help you move this forward? What is it that maintains the United States as the #1 biomedical research country in the world? We need to take action there. And that is an investment in the industry to keep that #1 position, because that's so important as we compete with other nations and as we cooperate with other nations to be able to be in a position where we can help regulate that.
I did a podcast with Robert Coughlin. You know Robert, he was the former head of Mass Bio, former politician at a high level, was assistant governor, I think, of the state of Massachusetts. He now works for Jones Lang LaSalle. and he's the head of their biotech practice.
Yeah.
In our podcast, he said he saw 14 million square feet of unleased lab space in Massachusetts. The Wall Street Journal on December 29th published an article saying that they have a 30% vacancy rate right now in Massachusetts for lab space. Okay, this is very particular for the Boston corridor. Are you seeing a real downturn in lab utilization, startups, spin-ups? Look, I was supposed to be in Charlotte today. It's 0 degrees and it's going to be snowing this weekend. We're here at 74. Beautiful day. Okay, yeah. There's tractability for being in California that other places don't have. Is that weather enough to keep the companies here right now?
The weather's not so much affecting our vacancy rates.
Yeah.
We're suffering the same issues that our brethren in Boston are suffering, and that is, if you look at the Bay Area, if you look at San Diego, if you look at Boston, all hovering around 30% vacancy rates. And if you look at what's happened over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, the run-up in funding for the pandemic, and everybody jumping in and supporting during the pandemic, it's really should be one of our major moments of success as an industry. It's too bad it became politicized because it really was quite an accomplishment. But that run-up where all that money flooded into the industry, there was a precipitous drop-off, as you saw in 2022. That drop-off was not just in funding. It was also in the number of people that were needed and the number of laborers needed in manufacturing. And so you saw layoffs as well. And then you also see vacancy rates go up because you can't turn over that real estate. So it's sitting vacant, and I think our real estate partners in there are being very patient about this and saying we're hoping that the industry is going to come back, and they feel pretty good about 2026.
A lot of the California politicians, when IRA was passed, they said, well, this is better than what we would have had with H.R. 3. Certainly Scott Peters, representative here, was very instrumental in overturning H.R. 3. Granted, it took until getting to committee, but it was overturned. What's the opinion now? I think there was a general feeling that, well, the IRA is not that bad. It's not going to have that much of an impact. Is there a willingness to go back now and pry this thing open and try and fix it?
It's certainly a different time, and there's a different administration in charge, and so there's a different strategy there. On a side note about Scott Peters, he has done yeoman's work for the industry. I think we've awarded him Legislator of the Year 8 times from Biocom, and he's earned it every time.
Sure.
In terms of the IRA, I mean, the interesting thing about it is when it came out, it felt like a big deal for the industry. And it's feeling less and less like it's as impactful, mainly because of what's happened in 2025. And the new administration coming in and saying, oh, it's not just about IRA and Medicare, it's also about tariffs and executive orders and Section 232 and 17 letters, most favored nation, and 17 letters to pharma. The Trump administration is pulling every lever when it comes to addressing pricing. And then on top of that, you fire 10,000 HHS employees, you threaten NIH funding, and through all of that, it's a very unsettling effect for the industry. And if you're a venture capitalist watching that happen, you're naturally going to pause before you invest and make sure that you understand what's happening when the dust settles.
In venture capitalists, I think there's a misnomer or misunderstanding that a lot of people think that just because a VC invests in biotech or biopharma, that they're always going to invest in biopharma. There's nothing stopping a VC from saying, okay, we're done with this now. Now we're going to AI, or we're going to software, or we're going to apps, or somewhere else.
Yeah, they have limited partners that will give them feedback and say maybe we should be moving to a different industry like tech.
Money goes where it's most loved. I think that's the former CEO of Citibank who said that in the restructuring of New York. We've danced around Most Favored Nations a few times. I think it's about time we open that up. Most Favored Nations was initially introduced in 2019. We were involved in the court case with that went to Bio. We provided the economic analysis and the court injunction. It was actually had a stay put against it, and then it was never brought up again by the Biden administration, so it just kind of died. The Trump administration has brought it back. What are we looking at? Well, if you model out the second model that they're talking about, the second lowest price in the basket, which we've done for 40 oncology products, depending on which country you use as the benchmark, you see that 50 to 80% of the oncology products that we've analyzed would have a negative return on investment if MFN was in place at the time that those drugs were launched. So this is going to have a devastating impact on drugs again, further with drugs that have a high exposure to the Medicare age population.
MFN and any other type of international reference pricing, whether it's Medicare B with Globe or Medicare D with Guard or anything else, is poorly done and misguided. It's going to have a devastating effect on the entire industry, and it's going to disproportionately affect smaller companies who can ill afford to kind of navigate that.
How do we get around this? Because this is an executive order.
Yeah.
We were part of the court case that had been filed by John Murphy at Bio when he was there. That was successful. Are there any limits to getting MFN arrested somehow?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the middle of this right now.
Okay.
As you know, the entire industry is spending time in Washington trying to let folks know the effect that this will have on the industry. Biocom has taken a very strong position on this against MFN in any form, and trying to codify existing letters or anything is going to be a really tragic circumstance. And this is why large pharmaceutical companies have gone and done their own deals. I mean, they're being very smart about this and saying, look, we need to do something for ourselves at this point because we just don't know what's going to happen if any of this gets codified.
The most of your members are companies that don't have a product.
Yeah.
They're early stage venture capital, probably phase 1, phase 2, coming into phase 3. They're cutting deals with the large companies, but basically they're burning cash, they're trying to survive, and they're trying to get an asset across the finish line. They don't have that ability to go in and negotiate directly with the president. Obviously, a VC is going to say, like you said earlier, we're just going to walk away from this asset if it has exposure to Medicare. What happens now going forward if we're not putting drugs out for the Medicare age population? Because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing an enormous pullback from either small molecules for the Medicare age population or a movement from assets of small molecules to large molecules, which, for better or for worse, will increase costs. And I don't think people are talking about this. This has not been analyzed. What happens if we start avoiding the Medicare age population?
It's going to be problematic. We need to feel fortunate by the fact that we have more drugs available to us as Americans than most countries do. If you live in China right now and you catch some disorder, you have some disease, and there's no real treatments available, you're going to enter a clinical trial because the clinical trial actually has a protocol and they're going to treat you and it's going to be good for you. But most countries don't have the support that we have here. And so we do take that for granted, but at the same time, we lead the world in biomedical research. We also need to lead the world in healthcare and how it's provided. It has to be about access, and it has to be about making sure that drugs are affordable. It has to be about making sure that the middlemen that are involved there, both PBMs and insurance companies, are doing their fair share to make drugs affordable, because that is a real problem when you go to get a prescription and you're denied. It's not the pharmaceutical company that's denying you, it's the insurance company that's denying you. And when you get a generic drug that's $300 a pill at a hospital, that's not the pharmaceutical company that's charging you that. Those are the middlemen that are charging you that. And so we need to make sure that Congress understands that at each part of the supply chain, we all need to own our part.
If we look at this from the standpoint of global pricing, obviously MFN has tractability because it's a very sexy argument to come on the television and say the average price in Europe is 62% lower net than it is in the United States. And that is a fact, it is. If it's not saying, okay, we're going to force the companies to do this, how else can this be fixed?
I do think that other nations need to understand that there's a cost to being able to have innovative drugs available to them. Keep in mind, as I said, Europe doesn't have nearly the number of drugs available to them that we have in the United States. And so as they get those additional innovative drugs, they need to pay the cost of those innovative drugs. And then here in the United States, we need to have regulatory support in being able to efficiently move drugs through the system. And that doesn't exist right now. It's very expensive to do that, particularly when it comes to clinical trials. And when you look at the cost of a clinical trial, that is the bulk of the drug cost. And to be able to apply AIs to that, to be able to enroll faster, to be able to look at how we can use electronic medical records and search across them to find patients who are available for these trials. All of these opportunities to make drugs cheaper are things that the FDA needs to support. And if we have the type of leadership at the FDA that I think we have, they're interested in this. We just need to get some details and guidelines around how we can make that happen.
Should this be part of trade? I mean, should the Trump administration be putting these into these tariff negotiations? Has this been done? It doesn't seem like it has. It seems like the onus is living on the pharma companies. The reality is the company has no leverage with a single buyer to government. And in fact, the European Commission in May of last year put in place the ability to do a single one-stop compulsory license at the European level. So if a company says, okay, we're not going to supply you because we don't like the price, and ultimately that's all they can do is walk away. The fact is now the European Commission has put in place the ability to put in a compulsory license across all 27 member states. Doesn't this need to be actual trade? Doesn't the Trump administration need to be negotiating on behalf of the industry? Doesn't that make the most sense?
I think it does make sense. The strategy so far has been to use a cudgel instead of a carrot. To try to entice people to the table to talk these things through. And so we're talking about a level of sophistication in terms of understanding the industry to be able to put the right types of programs in place. And that's here at the US, but it's also in how we deal with our trade partners.
Let's look at this from an international perspective, because we've been talking about the problems between Europe and the United States, but increasingly there's a third player. There's China. Now, 5 years ago, China was only registering 100 clinical trials with the FDA. Now, last year, there's been a full order of magnitude. We saw over 1,000 clinical trials registered by China with the FDA. In fact, last year, Chinese companies have eclipsed European companies with filing clinical research with the FDA. And a current trend, China is going to exceed the US clinical trial registrations by 2028. There are many Chinese biotech companies setting up here in California. They're registering as LLCs, they're growing, they're doing good science. How do we balance the need and obviously the desire to have good science here? I think we want competition, but how do you see this competition evolving with China, particularly here in California where there are so many Chinese companies setting up?
We've always had Chinese companies and researchers that came to California, research institutions from China, wanted to spin out a company, maybe utilize their resources in China to be able to do that very efficiently. And we still have that today. The thing to think about with regard to China is that they are a partner in drug development in many ways, and they're also a competitor. And that's a very delicate balance. And it mostly means that we need to be very protective of IP in certain situations. But as a partner, 75% of early phase preclinical development work goes to China. And it's because there's really high quality partners there that do that work, and they're much less expensive than US partners. And so when you look at that and say, well, we kind of created that ourselves. The US is very good at taking a technology, developing it to a certain point, and then saying, let's outsource this somewhere else where we can get it done cheaper. I wrote an op-ed at the end of last year about the US needs to determine what it wants to invest in if it wants to remain number one and leader in a position for particular industries. If you look at the shipping industry, for example, by World War II, the US had manufactured 7,800 ships over 30 years and was the leader, the absolute leader during World War II when it came to both commercial and military shipping. We also had the Federal Maritime Act, which allowed us to control the shipping routes. And we were in absolute control of both shipping as well as the shipping routes. And in the 80s, we decided to get out of the business. We closed down the Federal Maritime Organization. We stopped building ships. Today, 80% of the ships are built in China. The ship-to-shore cranes, 80% of them are built in China. 90% of the sea containers are built in China. 80-some% of the truck chassis that they're shipped on are built in China. We gave up to the point that we no longer lead that industry. And today, we make less than 1% of all the ships, and we have no control over the shipping lanes. There's a 3-company cartel that basically controls all the shipping in the world. When we want to be a leader in an industry, we're very good at it. We did the same thing with semiconductor chips. 36% of the semiconductor chips in the 90s were made in the United States, and today it's less than 10%. We tried to buy our way back in with the $4 billion CHIPS Act, and that's a start, but that $4 billion is basically building 4 chip plants in the United States, whereas Taiwan is currently building 10 chip plants and China's building another 10 chip plants. So it's a little bit too late in trying to get back into that game. We're currently number 1 in biomedical research. And by reducing NIH funding, by providing difficulties in the stability of our market such that VC money doesn't want to participate anymore, we're quickly giving that up. And the data shows in the numbers that you just mentioned, the amount of biotech companies in China that are now competing with us, and the number of deals that are getting done by global major pharma companies that are saying, I need to support this $350 billion patent cliff that I'm running into. Where am I going to get my next drug? And it's just as easy to go to China to get that drug as it is to find companies in the United States.
You mentioned patents.
Yeah.
Aside from being a very successful entrepreneur, leading to great acquisitions, you've also been a lawyer. You're a member of the California Bar. You obviously know the legal side of the business extremely well. Secretary Lutnick, as part of the administration, is talking about demanding royalties from university-developed intellectual property. I've heard numbers as high as 50% royalties. Just a quick back of the envelope on this. We've been tasked by the Bayh-Dole Coalition and the American Association of Universities to look at this issue. We've been able to obtain 271,000 patents since 1975 that have a government interest statement. Through those, we've been able to find financials on 180,000 of those patents that have ties through PitchBook. But the reality is this: if you look at those 180,000 patents, you look at the mean number of patents a firm has, it's 1. You look at the median number of patents a firm has, it's 1. You look at the 75th percentile of number of patents they have, it's 1 patent. In fact, it's 1% of the companies that have 75% of all the patents. The vast majority of the patents are small spin-outs that they're trying to develop these assets, and they have probably a lot of failure. But without those failures, you don't get those 1%. You're not going to get that consolidation.
That's right.
You're not going to get that home run. But it's not even a Pareto curve. It's like an ultra Pareto curve. It's like this amazing consolidation there. It's like 1 home run for 99 losses. What's going to happen if we start demanding a 50% royalty from day 1 on assets spinning out of Scripps, spinning out of UCSD, spinning out of some of the firms you've worked with, where 90% of them fail, 95% of them fail, but you're still going to have to pay out some alleged value of 50%. What happens to the sector?
We talk about the importance of NIH funding to be that catalyst for innovation. We talk about STTR funding being critical to help companies get across the valley of death. And we talk about the importance of VC funding to be able to carry that out through commercialization. But Bayh-Dole and the Bayh-Dole Act is foundational to all of that happening, because it gives permission to a university to go ahead and make royalties and make those disclosures, and knowing that you may make a little something on that at some point, and encouraging them to profit from NIH-funded, government-funded patents. The same is true with venture-backed entities that carry that to commercialization. They are critical, knowing that Bayh-Dole allows them to make a profit on that. That's why they invest, and that's why innovation is moving forward, is because there's an opportunity for investors to get involved and to make a profit. And if you have margin rights where the government can come in and take that, or if you have innovation tax where it's up to 50%, as you said, that's really going to have a chilling effect on the investment environment. Universities are not going to have that ability to move things out as readily and as efficiently as they are. And VCs are going to hesitate before they take over a company knowing that there may be something waiting for them on the other side of that development program.
So you've got IP challenges, we've got MFN challenges on pricing globally, you've got the residual impacts of IRA, which are now unarguable, they are happening. Yet, here we are in California, again, beautiful 75-degree day as I've mentioned. You've had 2 Nobel Prizes in the last 2 years. One went to DeepMind, a Google company, for AI. You've also had quantum computing that won a Nobel Prize. That's Berkeley University, 3 academics there. There is fantastic, innovative, groundbreaking science here in California, still, unquestionable. Yet you have all these headwinds, most of them self-inflicted gunshot wounds in the feet.
Yeah.
What happens? How do you square this? How do you square these opportunities? Where do you see things 5 years from now, given both these enormous challenges as well as these amazing homegrown California technologies?
I feel very optimistic about where this can go. The only industry in California that's larger than the biotech industry, which by the way is bigger than movie making, wine growing, tourism, and agriculture combined, is the tech industry. And we've been holding a conference called Converge for the last 3 years. And it's all about how does technology intersect with biology. And as you can imagine, it's mostly about AI. And so we have companies like NVIDIA and Microsoft that are participating with our biotech companies. And they're saying, what is it that we can do to make this a more efficient process for you? What is it that we can do to help you design drugs that are better? What is it that we can do to make clinical trials cheaper? I moderated a panel at Converge that was focused on clinical trials. And we had a regulator there, and we kept asking them, is this something that the FDA would be comfortable with? We were talking about AIs to comb across electronic medical records to find patients that could be candidates for a particular trial. We talked about digital twins that could obviate the need for a placebo. All of this reducing the cost and time of a clinical trial, thereby making drugs cheaper for patients. And the regulator at the time just said, the FDA is all for all of this. They want to make this as efficient as possible. And so our ability to be able to apply technology to the life sciences right now is at a very great moment. And so there's going to be a lot that's happening now and going forward.
So 5 years from now, where do we think we're at?
Oh, wildly optimistic. Wildly optimistic about this. I mean, I'm always this way. I was this way a year ago too, which may have been a mistake, but wildly optimistic about where things are going. You can't be a biotech entrepreneur without being optimistic about the future because, you know, as we tell our folks, there's a lot going on in the world right now. There's a lot of noise out there. What you can concentrate on and what you can make happen is the science that you do really well. So keep doing the science that you're doing. Stay focused on solving unmet medical needs, and good things will happen after that.
Well, Tim, it's really great that you're here. I'm really happy to see you in the chair of Biocom. It's been under the command of one person, Joe Panetta, a friend of both of ours, and it's great to see it in the hands of a very accomplished and wonderful person. I wish you all success, Tim.
Thanks, good to be here. Thanks, Duane.
Cheers.
Video by Rico Molden and Ben Harbour. Editing by Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2026.